The Turkish Prime Minister hailed the vote on constitutional reform in his country as historic, eyeing a long-awaited membership of the EU. Member states say much more is needed. Just how far is Turkey from winning its way into the European Union? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Nick Clark. Welcome to the programme. Turkish people say yes to changing the country's constitution, originally drafted by leaders of a military coup back in the 1980s. The package of amendments was prepared by the country's ruling AK party, who've wanted to change the constitution since coming to power in 2002. The move was finally endorsed in a referendum that took place on Sunday. Now, in total, there will be 26 changes. Here's some of them. Military officers can now be tried in civilian courts for crimes against civilians. Immunity from prosecution granted to the officers behind the 1980 coup will be lifted. Elected members will be allowed to stay in Parliament even if their political party is banned. The Constitutional Court will have 17 judges instead of 11 chosen by the President and Parliament. Rights of children, women, widows, orphans, the elderly and the handicapped will be better protected, and privacy of an individual's data will be respected, while labour laws will be strengthened. Politically motivated strikes will no longer be banned, and public sector workers will have the right to collective bargaining. So there's a sampling of what we're talking about. But is it enough to steer Turkey into the European club they apparently are so keen to join? We're joined by our guest to discuss all of this in Istanbul, Hasan Koni, Professor of International Law and Relations at Istanbul University. In Brussels, Hugo Brady, Senior Research Fellow at the Centre of European Reform. And in London, Fadi Hakura, who's an expert in Turkish affairs in the European programme at Chatham House. Gentlemen all, welcome to the programme. Professor Koni, if I could start with you in Istanbul first of all. What's your view? Will this add the necessary impetus to Turkey's bid to EU membership?
Well, I mean, Turks, they don't feel too much attracted to the European Union anymore because there are some reasons for it. First, the rising of anti-Islamist feelings within the European countries, and nationalism is also rising in the European countries, and their economic situation is worsening. And plus, there's this factor of Mrs. Merkel and Sarkozy in France. Those are the hindrance factors for the Turkish participation to the European Union. So most of them are cultural problems, as you see, and they have nothing to do with the constitutional change.
But when you say Turks don't want to be part of the European Union, do you mean the people at large, or do you mean the government as well?
I mean, most of the Turkish people living in Turkey, they don't feel like participating to the European Union anymore. It's not attracting anymore because there are new markets in the Middle East and in Central Asia and in Asia. As you know, there are 3 billion new consumers in Asia. So we are opening to those new consumers in the Middle East and in Asia. And there are only 400 million old consumers in Europe, and still we are looking for Europe, but not so.
Okay, well let's bring in Fadi Hakura. What do you think? Do you agree with that? Do you think there's no need for Turkey to be part of the European Union as far as the Turkish people are concerned, or are we perhaps closer to EU membership?
I think I agree with Professor Koni that most Turks today are not that much keen on Turkish membership. I would just add that it's not only the problems in Europe that the process has slowed down, but also the reform momentum in Turkey itself has dramatically slowed down. The constitutional debate, constitutional referendum that took place had very little to do with Europe and much more to do with the internal dynamics within Turkey. So unless there's a reignition of reform within Turkey and a change of attitude towards Turkey in Europe, I think that the accession process is likely to either grind to a halt or continue in a comatose state.
Okay, well, Hugo Brady, the referendum little to do with Europe, more to do with the internal dynamics. Is that how you see it?
Well, I think that's right. In fact, I think it's a bit like holding a map upside down to say that the referendum is primarily connected to Turkey's future relationship with Europe, and not only that, but in a sense, the West the rest of the West, if you like, is very pleased, of course, that the referendum has passed, but equally will reflect that for many years the army, through questionable means at times, kept Turkish society secular and, to their minds, free. So the European Union issue comes into it because if the generals can no longer guarantee that, and we're a long way from any worry that Turkey would suddenly become an Islamist society, then is it European Union membership that exacts that pressure from now on? I tend to agree with the first speaker as well, that Europe has lost some of its attractiveness for Turks, but at the same time, it's still the world's highest quality of life. Many Turks would appreciate visa-free travel to the EU and other benefits of membership. So it's, I think that the pull of the EU membership is considerably reduced, especially in this recession, but not dead yet.
Okay, well, the EU welcomed the vote's outcome, but the bloc's enlargement commissioner urged Ankara to do more. Let's have a look at what he said. The reforms are a step in the right direction as they address a number of long-standing priorities in Turkey's efforts towards fully complying with the accession criteria. Now, the vote needs to be followed by other much-needed reforms to address the remaining priorities in the area of fundamental rights, such as freedom of expression and the freedom of religion. Now, let's move to Germany, which opposes Turkey's accession to the EU, and it did welcome the reforms, calling them an important step towards Europe and its potential membership, if it's actually wanted. Its foreign minister had this to say: "I welcome the success of the referendum. The reform of the constitution is another important step by Turkey on the road towards Europe." The contents of the reform package were discussed intensively in Turkey. This discussion within civil society, as well as the concrete distribution of the balance of power within the state, is very much to be welcomed. Professor Kony in Istanbul, interesting to hear the German view there. They've always been opponents to Turkey gaining membership in the European Union, as you mentioned earlier, like France.
I mean, these reforms, as been said by one of the speakers, are made for the internal reasons. I mean, most of the reform, the most important ones, is on the judiciary. So this means that the government and the parliament and the judiciary will be at the hands of the AKP party. So that's why the other people are objecting this kind of constitutional change. And those things has nothing to do with the European Union participation. And plus, there's this kind of clash between the newly rising pro-Islamist central Anatolian elite and the pro-Western old elite. So this shows a sort of newly developing population within Turkey and clashes between the modernized and non-modernized people of Turkey. So this has nothing to do with the European Union.
Okay, well, perhaps
maybe
if what you're saying is right, that's as may be, but then perhaps some of the issues that Europe is demanding to be satisfied about before Turkey can consider are important issues nevertheless for Turkey to take on board, aren't they? Hasan Kony, Paris and Berlin, they favour a privileged partnership with Turkey rather than membership in itself. Is that perhaps the way forward that you would see Turkey progressing rather than, as you say, not being part of the European Union?
I mean, privileged membership cannot be accepted by this government or by any other Turkish government, and it will take a long time to be for Turkey to be a member of the European Union. And within this time period, what's going to happen to Europe? People are wondering this because there are some problems developing within the European Union. If it takes 10 or 15 years, there will be a lot of changes in the world. So they cannot wait for the privileged membership and then realize what's going to happen around the world.
And Fadi Hakura, is that the way you see it going, that Turkey will now just concentrate on its relations elsewhere outside Europe to progress as a nation?
I think if you look at the direction of trade and economic relations of Turkey, its trade ties are growing dramatically with the Middle East, with Africa, with Central Asia, with Russia, at a much faster rate than it is with Europe. So the relationship between Turkey and Europe will continue to be important. Around half of Turkey's trade is with Europe, but its ties will increase and expand with its neighboring regions, and I think that will continue, given that the accession process is pretty much in a comatose state.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the EU is demanding all sorts of changes on the Cyprus issue, on the Kurdish issue, on various human rights issues. Hugo Brady, do you think that if what all the three of you are saying is right, that Turkey can perhaps not proceed with the changes that Europe is demanding that they do proceed with in order to gain membership of the EU, if Turkey wants to go its own way in a different direction?
That's an interesting question. I mean, primarily, I think that the way the accession process is going at the moment is, as your other guest says, comatose. And inside Turkey, the political will to do anything that the EU says now is much weaker than it once was. But for both partners, I think membership would be a massive geostrategic opportunity. However, the political will in both the EU and Turkey for this very difficult merger, as it were, is difficult to see that coming to a successful fruition anytime soon. Certainly not for at least 5 years, if not 15. And you know, as your other guests say, in the meantime, the world will turn over many times. There would be more geopolitical events that will shape the world in a different direction. So we really can't say. Only events will push Turkey into the arms of Europe or vice versa. At the moment, those events aren't there. The forces are simply too weak.
So given that, Professor Kony, Hasan Kony in Istanbul, what will happen on issues like the Cyprus question? You know, Europe has been asking for Turkey to open its ports, for example. Will Turkey move on Cyprus, or will it just now choose perhaps, well, it doesn't need to make any progress as far as Europe is concerned on that question?
Well, now Turkey have internal problems, and this government believes that they have given enough concessions to the Greek side in order to solve the issue. Now they are looking for Europe to have some rights on this issue, and I believe they have in their minds this Bosnian problem-solving type of solution. That's why they are going to wait for it, and they don't care if Europe is refusing Turkey on this issue, or they refuse to give any membership.
Fadi Hakura?
I tend to agree. I think the government really took a major initiative on Cyprus in 2004 by promoting and accepting the Annan peace plan, which was at that time accepted by the international community, by the European Union, by the major power, by United Kingdom, the US, and so forth. And it was rejected overwhelmingly in a referendum by the Greek Cypriots, and accepted overwhelmingly by the Turkish Cypriots in a simultaneous referendum. So I think since that time, the Cyprus process has really dragged on, and I don't see any solution in the immediate term.
Okay, another issue, Hugo Brady, is the Kurdish question. And of course, as far as this particular referendum is concerned, a good many Kurds, the majority of Kurds, in fact, didn't take part.
Yes, I mean, I think Turkey's future, political future, is based much more on its own internal dynamics, and the Kurdish issue is an outstanding one. There is some fear that the military conflict that is there could worsen and could flare up again into what is more or less an open war. So that is a major issue in the future, and certainly. The progress of talks with Europe and the EU and so on sound almost like science fiction when you see the reality of the Kurdish situation at the moment.
Okay, well, in recent years, it's true to say that Turkey's regional influence, as you've all been alluding to, has been growing, has been building up. Now, historically, Turkey and Israel, for one. They share close military, strategic and diplomatic ties. True to say, though, that relations have been pretty rocky of late. We've seen the events with Mavi Marmara and so forth. Since last year, Turkey's relations with former adversary Syria have improved, ending 10 years of tension there. And Turkey, too, is one of the few countries in the region with strong diplomatic and economic ties with Iran, too. Also, the country has been working towards establishing ties with several Central Asian countries. Professor Kony, the Finnish foreign minister, recently said that it could be argued that Turkey is more influential than any other member country of the European Union in certain areas of the political arena right now anyway, as it stands.
And that's true, because from the point of view of anthropological culture, Turkey is close to those nations. And those nations in the Middle East and in Central Asia, in Asia, they don't see Turkey as an another. They see as people of themselves. So they accept their Turkish foreign policy, Turkish rapprochement with them. That's why it's more easy for the Turks to be with them, because it's been an empire. We have the culture of the Islam and we know the Arab culture. And in Central Asia, there are the Turkic peoples, even within China. So this is why it's very easy for the Turks to be in Afghanistan, to live with the Pakistanis, and to deal with them economically. Even within Russia, we have many Turkish tribes or Turkic tribes. So you see, this is an easy area for us, and is a developing and quickly rising economically area for us. So why not dealing with the old European all the time? Still we have some strong economic relations, but now the world eyes is towards Asia. Why not profiting from this?
All right. Well, the political landscape may well have changed since Turkey first started having ambitions towards Europe. And I was interested to read that the German foreign minister was talking about how it was, despite the fact that Germany is not keen on Turkey being part of the European Union, but he did say that it was in European interest for Turkey to remain orientated towards the West and does not reorientate itself in another direction. But that's precisely what all three of you are saying. Hugo Brady?
Yes, but I don't think that necessarily. I think that probably it may become obvious over the next few years that EU membership is actually too small for Turkey, which has become, as we've said, a geopolitical player in its own right. You've only got to look at the recent success of the Turkish foreign minister's diplomacy all over in several conflicts around the world. The question in my mind is, does Turkey actually want to join the European Union still? Obviously, it said it once did. But I think that Turkey might grow bigger than the EU question itself, than the idea that the EU is some... the idea of EU membership was always promoted by those inside Turkey who wanted the society to remain secular and Western orientated, and that the original linkage to being Western orientated was progress. If progress is to be found elsewhere, rather than in the tired old West, then does the issue remain so important? My own feeling on it is that actually it does, but nobody would blame the Turks for a certain moment of hubris, as they seem dynamic, young, and getting wealthier, whereas to the west of them is not not necessarily at the moment that clear that the West is going to be strong in the next 20 years, for example. My own view is that economic growth in Asia is unstable, and that, again, events will intervene to push the two closer together. But it's impossible to foresee exactly how.
Of course, absolutely. Now, Fadi Hakura, a little earlier you were talking about the internal dynamics of Turkey, and I guess everybody around the world observing Turkey from the outside is just waiting to see what Prime Minister Erdogan will do with this referendum victory and what's going to happen next in terms of the country and how he shapes it and how he shapes the constitution and so forth.
I think that that the Prime Minister Erdogan is probably going to continue with a more with a confrontational style of politics. You'll see continued clashes with the military, parts of the media establishment in Turkey, as well as some of the civil society groups in Turkey. Prime Minister Erdogan has spoken about introducing a more presidential system of government in Turkey within a new constitutional structure. That means greater centralization of power, which is exactly not what Turkey needs. What Turkey really needs is more decentralization of power, away from Ankara, more individualism, more individual initiative. But my fear is that those things that made Turkey special in the past, distinctive, are beginning to melt away now in Turkey.
Those special things about Turkey beginning to melt away, Professor Kony?
Oh, I mean, the centralization is going to be in the future. It seems so, but in order to centralize, Turkey should solve the Kurdish issue. And Kurdish issue can be solved only by decentralization. That's why it will be very difficult for the presidential system, and the parliamentarian system will go again. And then there are also other problems, just like the problems of the Alevis. We have Alevis and Sunnis, and Alevis are voted for yes in this referendum, but the next election, if nothing happened to them, they will vote no. So that's why they have too many problems. First, they should solve the internal problems of Turkey, and then they will proceed for other changes, I believe.
Hugo Brady, do you see right now, do you see a potential for big change about to happen, that we're on the brink of something very different, and that perhaps people from the outside who may be looking in may start to worry more about the prospect of the so-called Islamification of Turkey?
I don't think, well, as regards Islamification, the other speakers will probably give a better view on Turkey's domestic situation than I. But my own reading of the situation is that secularism is deeply enough rooted in Turkish society that sort of no amount of populist politics could rip it out. But the real danger is if this victory goes to Erdogan's head, if he starts to believe that he's inviolable and above the law. And if it ultimately weakens the rule of law in Turkey. All history shows that when power moves to the centre, the society and culture around it starts to weaken and slowly die.
Okay,
so that's the danger for Turkey.
Let me just bring in Fadi Hakura. We're just running out of time. Just very briefly, sir, what's your response to that?
I do agree with Mr. Brady. I think that's the real danger now in Turkey. It has a lot of internal problems, including the Kurdish issue, the Alevi issue, and if these are not settled, then really the secularism that made Turkey distinctive may begin to really melt away, as we are seeing today.
Okay, gentlemen, very interesting discussion. Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Hassan Kony, Fadi Hakura, and Hugo Brady. Good to have your perspective and your views on this programme. Thanks a lot. And thanks for watching this edition of Inside Story. Always keen to get your emails and your views and thoughts. Just email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Nick Clark, it's goodbye.